Welcome to your interactive lecture on understanding learning objectives. The pedagogy and use of learning objectives form one of the most important concepts in instruction. Without these important components to online learning, students have a great difficulty understanding what they are to learn in your course. More importantly, coursework can get confused with purpose when learning objectives are mixed with learning activities. This lecture explains what learning objectives are, the pedagogy behind them, and shows best practices when creating them. Let's start with an introduction to learning objectives. Click the Next button to continue. Instructors create learning objectives to describe goals. These goals illustrate to students what knowledge they gain by completing course activities. Learning objectives support activities of all types, most frequently at the module and course level. They form the foundation of course planning and take shape during course design. So how do you write effective learning objectives? Let's look first at their parts. There are 4 parts of a learning objective. Audience. Students form the audience of learning objectives. Audience takes into account students' prior knowledge of a subject, learning styles, and demographics. Behavior. Behavior shows an observable outcome, an outcome seen after completion of an activity. Conditions. Conditions of a learning objective consider student resources, environment, and time allotted to complete activities. Degree. How well your students perform an activity determines the learning objective's degree. The most effective learning objectives consist of all 4 components. However, not all learning objectives require all 4 to function pedagogically. Next, let's look at why we use learning objectives. Click the Next button to continue. Bloom's structure analyzes and arranges the goals found in educational processes. Your foundation for developing a curriculum depends on educational objectives. Why do students take your course, complete those assignments, or work in a particular module? Bloom's taxonomy answers these questions by specifying objectives. The model recognizes 3 domains of learning: psychomotor, affective, and cognitive. Online courses focus on the cognitive domain, which consists of 6 categories. These categories progress from lower levels of cognitive behavior, such as recollection and recognition, to increasingly more complex and abstract behaviors, such as creating and design. From lowest to highest, the 6 categories are called remember, understand, apply, analyze, evaluate, and create. Hover over each of the levels to the left to learn more details. Once you are done, click the Next button to continue. Remember, when students recall or retrieve data. For example, recalling a policy. Understand. When students understand the meaning of instructions and problems. Example, stating a problem in their own words. Apply. When students use a concept in a new situation. For example, applying course instruction to novel situations within assessments. Analyze. When students separate course materials into component parts. For example, troubleshooting equipment through logical deduction. Evaluate. When students make judgments about ideals. For example, selecting the best solution. Create. When students build structure or patterns. Example, writing a process manual. Your assessment of student learning frequently will include 1 or more cognitive categories. How well a student performs determines whether they obtain the goals of instruction. Learning objectives detail what students learn upon completion of course activities while advertising the goals students strive to reach. Please hover over each of the categories below for examples of verbs that are used to construct learning objectives. Once you are done, click the Next button for a knowledge quick check. Remember skills. These skills focus on definitions, terms, and categories. Here, students recognize or recall information. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Understand skills. These skills focus on interpreting or developing explanations of ideas. Here, students transform information into language and symbolic forms. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Apply skills. These skills focus on using judgment to answer questions when no guidelines are detailed. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Analyze skills. These skills focus on the ability to outline relevant points, evaluating course content and its fundamental parts. Your students then divide course data into fundamental parts. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Evaluate skills. These skills focus on making judgments based on principles provided. The student makes approximate and perceptible choices due to specific requirements. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Create skills. These skills focus on combining components to form something that is original. Your students answer a problem by placing information together that requires creative thinking. Consider the following verbs to show behavior in a learning objective. Drag and drop to reorder the learning categories from lower, 1, to higher, 6, according to Bloom's taxonomy. When you are ready, click the Submit button. Now that we have discussed the effectiveness of cognitive domains within learning objectives, let's look at how objectives are created. Knowledge and cognitive processes combine to create learning objectives. The following is a visual example of this process. Hover over each of the squares to see an example of a learning objective. When you are ready, click the Next button to continue. Now that we know what learning objectives are, why we need them, and how they form, we can learn to write them. Learning objectives are not learning activities. Here is the difference. Instructors write learning objectives to show skills learned by completing learning activities. Instructors write learning objectives using the A, B, C, D format. A stands for audience, your students and their characteristics, including demographics, prerequisite knowledge, etc. B stands for behavior, the observable outcome that reveals students have learned the objective. C stands for conditions, the environment, tools available, and time span in which the student will perform the observable outcome. And D, degree. The degree of mastery measures how effectively students perform an objective. Click the Next button for a quick check on writing learning objectives. Below is an example of a learning objective. Referencing the A, B, C, D format, identify the highlighted portion of the learning objective. When you are ready, click the Submit button. Below is an example of a learning objective. Referencing the A, B, C, D format, identify the highlighted portion of the learning objective. When you are ready, click the Submit button. Below is an example of a learning objective. Referencing the ABCD format, identify the missing portion. When you are ready, click the Submit button.